Sina, what the hell are we doing here, man? I don't even know. Hello, everybody. Please take a minute,
Hello.
like, share, subscribe.
The question we ask ourselves every day when we look in the mirror is also the question that begins this. You know, Jay, I will say this. I don't know. I say this every time, but I feel like when people use adult words like colleagues, and I'm like, Sina, you work on the internet, you don't have colleagues. And then I'm like, no, I have at least one colleague. His name is Jay. I know him very well. We came up together. So like when I say that, I really do love talking to you. I see your work all the time. You are always doing live stream jihad, and I support you in every way possible. So I'm here. I'm excited. 7 people asked for this, so we're here to give these people what they want.
You were like, people loved it. They want more. I'm like, how many? 7 is the answer. There are 7 of us.
There are dozens of us. Dozens. Yeah. So I'm excited. We're excited to be here today. We were doing these. We did this inside the podcaster studio thing, but I said, Jay, let's do it again. So here we are. Now you're all caught up.
Yeah, for sure. And we should probably. This is a good episode, as we've done a few times, that we could plug some like fundraisers and stuff like that. Like, yeah. I know by the way, happy birthday. I know you just celebrated your birthday.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Let everybody know, really for the purpose just of promoting some fundraisers from Gaza. And so, I know that that's deeply appreciated, and it's like very, yeah, I mean, Gaza, the people in Gaza absolutely need it. I know they hit us up. And I need to get better about continuing to do that. And I also need to have Hala back on from the Samir project and do another episode with her. But yeah, anyways, we can do that a couple times throughout this today too. So, but where did you want to start?
So I've been, like all these conversations, we don't have a beginning or an end point. It's more kind of like, I feel like the practice of this job, of this weird podcasting thing of like talking into the void called the internet for like a few thousand people at a time, that it can feel weird. Like, and I'll say this, I'll begin this with a provocation. The other day, I said out loud for the first time, this year it's going to be 8 years. Like this year of the birthday of my show is Halloween for some reason. I posted on Halloween. And it's going to be 8 years this October. And I thought to myself, if I am doing this in 2 years, if this show turns 10, I should just quit. Like 10 is a good number, and there's no reason to keep going after 10. I don't know. I just thought that for a second, and I had never said that before. It had never come out of my mouth. It had never occurred to me that I would not be doing this show. But sometimes, and then you realize, like every human being who does a thing sometimes says to themselves, maybe I could do something else. Maybe I could, do a different job. But so I had never really considered, like, what would I do if I wasn't doing this? Like if I wasn't producing podcasts. So, sometimes I think like we could do, and we've talked about doing these projects together, kind of podcast adjacent, right? Content making. But the wider question is like that I want to ask you and the audience today, like, what does it mean to make this content, which for our own explicit purposes, like we've named them as like, we want to radicalize people. We want people to get radicalized in the right direction, of course, not in the bad direction, and see that like the roots of our society are, and like look at them and contemplate them and talk about them and expose them and shine a light on them and whatever metaphor you want to use. So and our space is small. Like our space is not that big, but you realize that like our being small has its advantages. Being small, the thought of, and we asked this last time, the thought of being like Hassan Piker's size, that every day to log on to have like 300,000 people chatting with me. I don't know. I've never actually seen his streams. I've just seen clips, but the intensity of that sort of social world of big streamers, I could never take that. Like I get like 10 comments and I'm overwhelmed. So it's funny. I've gotten used to obscurity in all of this. Like I've gotten, obscurity. I like obscurity. Give me more. but you realize that like obscurity is also like a blanket for yourself. Like you hold that, you say like, you know, you want to say like, okay, nobody really sees me, it doesn't really matter what I say, you know. And then that's the thing, like that's the weird trade-off, is that if you want to be obscure, then you're like, okay, then you have nothing, you don't want to get your message out. But then if you want to be popular, I ask people like, why are you trying to be popular? Like, so it's like, it's almost like a you can't win situation. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, what do you think?
That's a lot of good stuff. I mean, for one, when you reached out to do this, you had some prompt in the beginning, which maybe we'll come back to, of like, you know, Iran changing the world and the media ecosystem and all of this, and where do we fit into it? And I, you know, I was kind of like, I don't even know, you know, because, but this, the line of thinking that you just went on, I think is way more close to actually where I'm at, which the thought of like retiring or like sunsetting or whatever we want to call it, the podcast, has actually been on my mind a lot lately. You know, and it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, similarly, I've been doing it almost 9 years now, and you know, 10 also is very close. And I've been, when I started it, I had a real full-time job, you know, um, and I did that for like 5 years, so about half of the life of the podcast, maybe a little more. I don't know, about half. You know, I was doing a full-time job, and then I was producing it along with Josh on, you know, nights and weekends and whenever I could steal some time to edit and that kind of stuff. And I loved it, right? And I do still think that I, you know, enjoy it most of the time. But it is a lot of work, and it's also not, you know, it's not well compensated work, right? Like, especially at the level that we do it. Um, and so that has been on my mind. And I also, though, am somebody who is kind of a workaholic and am compelled to do this stuff. And I also really do enjoy the interaction with the audience, which has been something that I didn't foresee, because for a long time we were just doing audio, and you know, you and I've talked about this, but you don't really get much interaction with your audience if you do audio. They might leave a comment here and there on one of the platforms, but um, you know, maybe they email you, that kind of stuff, but it's pretty rare. It's not, you know, once you get on YouTube, people treat you differently, and they kind of feel one, there's an ease of access, right? You can just talk in the chat right now, as I'm sure many people are doing. You can leave a comment, um, all of that. But there's also then, and you mentioned the obscurity piece. I mean, that's interesting. And for a long time, I felt like this. But actually, like if I go out to anything left wing oriented in any sort of way, like I get recognized at this point. So it's I don't know if you have that
People
experience
stop me in the
where you,
street in
yeah,
Toronto. Like it's the weirdest thing. Like, hey, have you seen it? I'm like, I think so. I hope so. Depends on who's asking.
who's
But
asking, right? No, totally.
yeah, which is the funniest thing in the world to me, because like how many thousands of people watch our show? Not that many, but it's that I think what you were saying. Sorry to interrupt you, but
No,
like
go ahead.
well, I wanted to add this, that the audio listeners, I find them more intense. Like I find them more dedicated fans. Like people, and I don't know. And mind you, we're kind of bifurcating people where that might not, a bifurcation is not necessarily true, because a lot of people do listen on YouTube. They have like apps where they can just turn it off, and YouTube is like the easiest thing for them. So we are mixing the registers, but your point still stands that you don't get much interaction compared to YouTube and audio. But I do find that the audio listeners, in some ways, are more intensely bonded with you, because you've spent time with them walking around, doing your life with them, like doing their lives with them. Like they're like you're like a companion in their lives. Like it's still, I will always say this, it is still weird to me that like I could walk by somebody sometime in the tiny village that I live in. This is never going to happen, but let's say it did. And someone could be listening to me talking, like, and not and never have encountered. So it's like that is a weird thing, because to go to the point of this is that we're not supposed to have this kind of platform, right? For the history of humanity, dudes like us, we just yelled at our local village and our family members and like the poor people around us, and that was it. Whereas, and only the ruling class got to get their message out. But that has fundamentally changed, and it's like that is kind of what we're dealing with. That era of like media monopoly is gone, and that kind of monocultural environment. And now you have almost the opposite problem, where there's so much noise. There's so much immense amount of noise. And remember, the social media era, the sort of rise of socials in like the mid 2000s preceded a major push of the imperialists across the planet, right? Where they use those tools. So don't think that those tools and like our transition from audio to video, from going to websites separately to now only being on a few, right? Like these were all part of a wider sort of digital media plan to gear us towards these voices. But that sphere has been shattered. That monocultural sphere has been shattered, and it's now into a million voices where, yeah, and I think it's probably, it's obviously in many ways preferable to that old world where, you know, only corporates, you only got your news from corporates. But the reality is that even with all of these alternative news, we still have this preponderance of normies in both of our respective societies. And it's a Westoid thing more generally of, oh, I heard on CBS today that they did this. Oh, I read in the New York Times today that they did this. And it's like, have we learned nothing? Have we learned nothing from the last 25 years? That you have to go out and curate your own news. You have to actively wage a kind of battle inside of that sphere to get, you know, good sources. Sometimes they contradict each other. Sometimes they're like completely insane. Like, again, like I follow almost 5,000 people on Twitter. You should see my Twitter feed. It's bananas, like all sorts of characters. But that's a tool for me. That's what feeds my show in some ways, because the things that I glean from those interactions, from just scanning, help me and fuel me. So it is, I just to put it back, let you go back to what you were saying. Like, I do think it's interesting that this YouTubeification of podcasts, right? It seems to me that it signifies it's like if you, here's a good point. I was thinking this the other day. You ever watch Breaking Points lately? Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball. I mean, I don't watch them a ton. They got on my feed, but I will say, like Ryan Graham and stuff, like those, that is a news channel. Those guys are doing news. They have a studio, they have a cameraman, they have like a thing. They sit there, they have their little notes. They go like this, you know, like, which is like what newscasters do. Like, I could never pull that off, but I would say, lived out though they are, that is an improvement to just CBS, right? Like that, I will say that is like better than just having a world where CBS and NBC and, you know, which is kind of the boomer media environment. So there's a generational thing happening. There's a technical thing happening. But yeah, the final point I will say is that I still do think that the original premise of this conversation, which is like the shattering of the American imperial world order in this Iran war, will have a lot of consequences for years and decades to come around media. Because in a lot of ways, I feel Americans will probably be mad if maybe they'll eventually get around to it. But they'll be mad. They'll say, why didn't we know that this war was going to be a disaster? Why didn't we do anything to stop this? Like, this is like when you get $9 gas, you're going to blame Zionists first, and then you're going to blame Trump, and then you'll blame yourself if you're honest and saying that, like, I let this happen. I let my country get taken over by like a Zionist goon. I let my people get so radicalized that they voted for this psychopath, murdering, rapist monster who's obviously being controlled by the worst actors on the planet, not once, but twice, and maybe thrice if he survives, if he wants to, right? Like, these are problems that come from media consumption. I feel that, like, or at least media consumption is a huge part, because it's also like fascism thrives in that same environment that we're thriving in too, right? Like the chuds, like Joe Rogan's podcast is the top of like any podcast download list, right? And he's an enemy. He's like a, you know, Epstein. He has like a roster of Epstein dudes, and like that That to me is a huge problem. Not just Joe Rogan himself, whatever, but I just mean in general, like the altogether degraded nature of the American intellect, and like kind of Westoid intellect has been manufactured. Like we are less literate, we are less critical, we consume way more media, but it's controlled by far fewer people. So we're all trending in the wrong direction. And here guys like you and me are swimming upstream, like with our little, like canoes on like, the Pacific Ocean of nonsense. So this is like, yeah, sometimes you think, okay, fuck it, what's the point of all of this? Like what am I here for? Like this little drop in the bucket. But then something like October 7th happens, something like, this Iran war happens, and you realize this is what I'm here for. Like, this is why I built this platform, for moments like this, where people are hungry for something that's not fascist Zionist lies peddled by the worst kind of liberals. They want like good, healthy, educational, they want like topics like, I don't know, like there's a lot of people who like the good vibes that I get from this show that people send me. They're like, oh, I'll come on your show anytime. Like literally the other day, some guy's like, I told him like, hey, we should talk about this on my show. He was overjoyed. He's like, you name a time, man, anytime you want. Like that never happened in my life when I was an academic. That never,
Sure, yeah.
That was never part of my life. That moment of like, I support you, I want to help you. Like people do our shows for free. Like we get paid to do our shows. They do it for free because they like us, because they're our friends, or they like our work. So it's like we're in a weird environment. Like we're in a strange kind of contradictory moment. It's good. I would say overall it's good. Like I'm happy I did this work. I'm happy my life took this direction. And you've been with me this whole time. Like I still remember my first episode with you. I recorded it sitting down on the floor because I didn't have a chair at my mom's house right after Soleimani, after they martyred Soleimani. And I remember that was our first episode. And I still think about, I think you said that one about how American human rights apparatus looks outwards. And I say that to myself like once every few weeks, that like, oh yeah, the thing Jay said 7 years ago in our episode. So these things I never would have gotten from like just living in normie media. I never would have had those moments.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on a lot of things. I think the difficulty, so there's one piece I would say of normie media that has been lost that I don't see being replaced in the way that it should be by whatever our ecosystem is. And maybe in a certain way it is, right? You talked about you following 5,000 people on Twitter and them being like your curated sources of information and all of that. And like that is some version of that, right? But one of the things, and I don't fetishize this concept, but the concept of investigative journalism, it look like first of all, like Hollywood has done a number on us on this, like we've all seen all the President's Men and, all of these kind of movies that, just, you're like, oh, those guys are amazing, and
speaking truth to power.
Heroes, what is it, like The Paper, like these kinds of, there's the one about also the folks in Boston, right, who uncover like all the Spotlight, like all of these kind of movies. But I do think that there is a missing component often, which is to get into investigation does require resources that are very difficult to replace just on reader supported, just on getting working class, which is what you would want, right? Working class and maybe middle class folks to support your platform, right? So that you had the resources to do it. It's usually funded by the ruling class, and the ruling class has largely just said, fuck it, we don't even care anymore. They basically said this is not something, and I think a lot of this just has to do with capitalism, right? They're like, this isn't worth it. We can make we can sell as many ads talking about whatever trended on, Twitter or TikTok yesterday as we can, you know, we can make more doing that actually than we can sending a reporter out to like build sources and, investigate something. Now, I recognize, of course, that so much of that work historically was done to support bad things, right? Like, like the whole field of war journalism and so on, right, is largely just to like manufacture consent and support the thing. Um, there are some interesting exceptions to that if you look at like Vietnam, right? But that was a very long time ago where I think the ruling class learned lessons from that, and was like, we're never doing that shit again. Like there's no way we're ever gonna allow a media to have like some level of, oh, like let's find out what's going on here. Like, no, we can't we can't have that. We have to have them, you know, embedded in units and everything really tightly controlled from a narrative sense. And you see that when you read Army, like even if you read the counterinsurgency field manual, like there's all this emphasis on like really ensuring that the narrative between the um the military, the NGOs, and the journalists is tight, and there's no like wiggle room there, and so on. So that's been destroyed in a number of ways. But I think also because part of my entry into podcasting was also with like the Beyond Prisons folks, and Brian Sonnenstein was part of that, who now works for Prison Policy Initiative, or Institute, PPI. But like he would always say, and that was what one of the things Shadowproof did for a while, was do reader supported journalism, like just have people pay to them so that they could actually pay journalists to go investigate something and he would teach people how to FOIA documents and how to do that kind of stuff. And I mean, there are some people who do that still. I do think that like however we feel about like the rise of drop site, or the like another example, I mean, Ken Klippenstein, like these people, like I'm not politically aligned, right, with these folks fully, but they at least are, I think, operating somewhat outside. But at the same time, like Dropsite gets a lot of money from like Soros and stuff like that, right? So it's like, how do you that's one of the pieces that I think is missing. And I guess what I would say broadly about this moment that we're in is, I think you're right. Like something has been destroyed, right? There is, and I'll say this too. We had a conversation about the Odyssey yesterday with Gemma DeCristo and M2 McGant, and Gemma said something that stuck with me also, though, which is that no country yet has created a propaganda like propaganda apparatus that's as strong as Hollywood. Right. So like even if we see it as in decline, even though it just had the highest grossing weekend in the history of Hollywood last weekend, um, even if we see it as like largely been in decline for a few years now, it's still able to produce content at a level, and very propagandized content, right? That not only has a big impact in the US, but still has a big global impact. And I mean, that's an interesting question, right? Is like, you know, I mean, Iran with the Lego videos and with everything else, like, has done a lot, I think, to upset the ability of like social media and legacy media to kind of manufacture a narrative. People largely understand the war is bullshit, but there's no anti-war movement in the United States right now. None. Like, and I don't mean this to be dismissive of the 12 people who are trying really hard to do that, but like it's quite apparent. We talked to Maris Azarmandi about this like a couple months ago, and talking about it globally, it's also similar. Like she's in New Zealand, and there's nothing there really. And she has a lot of reasons why. I mean, she actually blames in many ways kind of the liberal Iranian like diaspora folks. So less like the monarchists, but like more the like women, life, freedom, human rights oriented Iranian diaspora. Um, But I don't think we can solely place blame there, because I think this gets back to this question of media consumption and what types of subjects are being produced these days, right? Which I think that people that even come to us agree with us a lot ideologically. They're drawn to the things that we talk about and the guests that we bring on, and this like counter hegemonic perspectives and all of those things. But that's not necessarily a conveyor belt. There is some overlap there between them and like organizers and activists and folks like that. But there's also, I'm more and more conscious, and have been for years now, that there are a number of people who are consuming content like this all day long. But they're a lot of times they're doing it within their workplaces. Like they have a whatever kind of gig that they have, whether it's like independent work, kind of like what we do, or um, they're working for a software, or they're just in some place where people are still yet not fully surveilling everything that they're doing, and so they're able to do that. Maybe sometimes it's in between meetings. I see people in the chat that'll be like, "Oh, I have to go to a meeting now. I'll catch the rest later." Like that's a common, thing. And I mean, this is not a particularly revelatory thing. A lot of times I'm streaming at 10 a.m. in the morning in the East Coast. Like most people are fucking working, Jared. Like, duh, that's not, it would be shocking if they weren't. But I'm still, for years now, I've been a little bit concerned about this just being content, right? About this just being something that is less alienating to people to watch or listen to than the normie media, which once you're some level of political consciousness, and I do force myself to watch a lot of this stuff, it is super alienating because you're just watching, you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, are
Yeah.
you serious? Like, you expect people to believe this? Like, my wife actually should be like, they can't hear you, Jared. Like, they don't know. Like, because I'm
the TV doesn't have a
screaming at
mic.
them.
Well, it does, but it's not turned on yet by the CIA.
The CIA is listening to me yell at my TV,
Yes.
not the hosts. And so, yeah, I mean, there's more we could delve into with this, I think, but I do have a general fear, and I think it's partly because I watched this generationally. I see my parents' relationship to it. I know what my relationship to it all is like. I know what my kids' relationships to it are like. And the media still, in all of its forms, and even though there are more forms of it that people have access to now than ever, right? That might be what we could say. Maybe that's an interesting question. But it still becomes a consumption activity a lot of times for people, not necessarily what I hope it is a lot of times, which is like a sort of guide to action or ideas that are helpful for people while they're struggling. And I'm more and more concerned by the lack of struggle that I see. Having said that, like there are different interesting political developments that we could talk about in terms of that, but I'll table that for a little bit later.
No, that's a great point. I think the idea, yeah, like because the content, it's funny word because it's also like when we like look at like what's in hot dogs or something, they say contents. Like it's the same word, like filler. And sometimes you think like, am I day filler for like 2,000 people? Is my voice like filler for them? But the thing is that when you remember is that like what, even if that's, let's say it's true, right? But even if that's true, I feel that, well, at least I've stolen those 2 hours from somebody else. At least I've taken those away from somewhere that can, I don't know, do something good with that. At least like a guest that I bring on, and I've seen this happen too, and it makes me feel very happy that like a guest that I bring on, I see them go to other shows, and I see their platform grow, and it feeds everyone. And then you realize that we're all part of this weird, like digital terrarium, it feels like, and we kind of feed we create our own CO2, I guess, and we consume it in the way the terrariums work. But it's that we're, in a way, I think we are creating a kind of safe space for a small portion of people who have nowhere else to go, whose politics has shown them that, I'm hungry for something deeper. And remember that as much as we denigrate ourselves, like we have a lot of intellectual heft on our side. Like libs have Ian Bremmer or whatever his name is. Libs have like Richard Dawkins. Like that's who they have. Like we have giants, like who the best guy the libs have ever produced, Mersheimer, and he's still anti-China. Like he still can't even bring himself to be an anti-imperialist. He's just like, no, we're not doing imperialism properly. That the whole intellectual culture of the US is so captured by imperialism, not just the US, by the West in general, is so captured by imperialism and the material relation of that person's context to imperialism, that it can feel so overwhelming. Like how, and I said this to Nick, like what can we ever do with our little boat on an ocean? Like what can we ever do? Like our tiny thing, we'll never get that size. But then you realize that like we're in a holding pattern in some ways, that like we are waiting for this phase of American imperialism and its kind of media outgrowths to die. And it is dying. I believe that. Like we're watching it die. We've outlived previous segments of it, and it will die. This era of American media hegemony. I mean, Hollywood is not irrelevant, but its power over our lives has shrunk so much that it's hard to believe that, like, I don't even, when I go, I mean, I live far away from a city, and it's not a particularly big city, so they don't have many options. But when I drive by the movie theater, I'm like, what are the names of these movies? Like what? Like when it's just I don't recognize. Maybe I'm just getting older, but it's also that I think it's a recognition that the hitherto existing foundations of American cultural hegemony, including the news, which is part of that, are rotted away. And in a lot of ways, Zionists are like themselves taking sledgehammers and hammering it to help along the process, right? When you put CBS, like when you give CBS to Bari Weiss, the dumbest human being to walk the planet, like you are saying to everyone and yourselves that this is the best we can do. This is all we can do. We can just put our hateful little weasel who cried to her teachers about being mean to them. Like that's all they have. And they themselves destroyed CBS. But the thing is, because it's ruled by oligarchs who don't care, they don't care. They just say next. Who cares? We don't give a shit about your stupid media institution. It served imperialism before in that way. Now it serves imperialism this way. But the way that it serves Zionists doesn't necessarily help American imperialism in the way that it used to, right? Or maybe it doesn't help in a lot of ways, right? That it actually hurts American imperialists to be associated so closely with Zionists, because at some point imperialism took this neoliberal form where it started saying things like, this is good for you. It's good when we use depleted uranium on your country. It's taking the hijab off. You're learning how to be modern. Like that was a phase. And to sustain that phase, you need an army of liberals, not chuds, liberals. Chuds don't say this stuff. Chuds don't care. Chuds say stuff like burn it all down, whatever. But libs are the ones who sugarcoat it. They're the ones who lead us, which is why they prevail in their speeds. So I feel like, yeah, it goes both ways. That American power, American media has never been like that. Like our media sphere has never been more irrelevant, but it's also never been more relevant in a way, because we have to fight. We have to make a fight out of everything, including these little things that we can do. And so as those other mainstream platforms die, like they cater to the more hardcore base, which is generally growing older and more senile, and their wealth is sort of giving away, that like the younger people who don't care about Mike Wallace and Morley Safer and This Is 60 Minutes, the way that we were raised on that, because that was the only thing we had. We had 36 channels, maybe, if you were lucky, if you paid for cable. And you didn't even have cable, I think.
I had 3 channels when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Until
Oregon, right?
we did get satellite eventually, and that was like, it changed everything. But
God, the day you got satellite, was it like the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey? Were you like seeing stars?
It's amazing. I mean, I was watching Thundercats fucking dubbed, like I mean, we used to. I used to have my dad like we would. It's such satellite was so fucking crazy to people. Like people, if I sit and explain it to people, it will sound absolutely nuts because it's not like younger people might maybe have an experience with like DirecTV or Dish Network or something like that. It was nothing like that. It was like this massive thing that was out in our yard, and you had to type in G6/17 or whatever, and this big satellite would turn so that it could point at the satellite like somewhere out above Japan or something like that, right? And then you could get, I mean, it was amazing in some ways. Like it was the most amazing thing before the internet, and for a lot of even the early internet years, the technology of it was really even more amazing than the internet. I mean, the internet was amazing because you could connect with people all over and do AOL Instant Messenger and all that amazing stuff in the very beginning. But we could watch. I remember my father's glee that he could watch every basketball game in the world, like, or every baseball game. It didn't matter because in the beginning there was also
So this is where you get it from.
It was unregulated. Oh yes. My father still watches all 162 Red Sox games every year. Every single year.
Mashallah.
Yeah. And almost all Blazers games and some hockey games and some college football games. Well, a lot
Your
of
poor mother. Your poor mother.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, that was amazing. But for the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, like when I was growing up as a young child, it was 3 channels. That was it. We had NBC, we had ABC, and we had PBS, and that was it. We didn't even have access to CBS or Fox where we lived because like it was too far out in the middle of nowhere, and those signals just didn't reach by antenna back then. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, if you think about how crazy that is that we went from like over the air culture, right, which was TV, radio, right? Those two things were over the air. And then at some point in like the 80s, yeah, I love that movie, by the way. At some point, actually, if you should, I don't know if you've read the book, commenter, but the book is completely different than the movie. In the book, she has a Soviet boyfriend. She has like a Russian, like from the Soviet Union. It's amazing. It's completely different. They completely whitewashed that movie, lib-washed. Wait, what was I saying? Oh, so like we went from this thing of over the air, right, where like the environment around you affected it, to now we have this hardwired physical connection, right? And that was a huge thing. Like the history of HBO, it was CCTV at the beginning. At the beginning, it was actually, there was a cable going around New York City and that had HBO on it. And that was how crazy it was. It connected people. So now as this has evolved, and you're right, I remember we got cable when I was like in maybe grade 6 or grade 7, like a little bit as our kind of socioeconomic situation improved. But we had a lot of over the air channels because we were in Toronto, and Toronto is close to the US. So I remember all the like US affiliates like Cheektowaga, North Tonawanda, all these places in like upstate New York that I have never seen or I've never heard to this day. I don't even know if they actually exist, but these are all names. But that's because we were getting that over the air thing. And then same with radio. Radio was precious. I would listen to, on Sunday nights, Sleepless Sina, I would listen to the sports radio station, the Fan 590, or was it? Yeah, it was the Fan 590 AM radio in Toronto. Toronto people, give a shout out. And they had like a comedy hour. No, they had a radio classics era, of course, because it was out of copyright and it was free to post and it didn't matter. And so I would listen to The Shadow. That shit that like Woody Allen, like fetishizes in radio days. Like we lived the tail end of that era, which is crazy to think. And now I'm watching my nephews, you're watching your son, like carry around a portable movie studio in their pockets where any piece of media is available at any time. And that's mostly a bad thing for like the human mind, but a good thing in terms of breaking free of like the media chokehold. And so it's like
What's
a weird,
interesting,
yeah. Go ahead.
what's interesting in that particular instance, and this, risks getting too, too based on my own experiences with this and so on and so forth, but is that my kids, and this is something that I think I hear from other folks with young kids too, is that they don't actually gravitate towards TV shows. They don't actually gravitate towards movies, right? There is the people do talk, like there's the TikTok, the reel, the short, right? There's the short clip stuff, and they do watch that stuff some. But actually, what I find really interesting is, and I still am really trying to figure out like what psychological, like what is the psychology behind this specific thing, is that they like streamers who stream for hours, right? And that's a really interesting thing, because, and it's also, I've found doing this stuff on YouTube that's also, some people want the short content for sure. Like I do have people who hit me up and thank me when we make a clip or like a 10 to 30 minute, cut out of one of the episodes to make a shorter video for people who have less time in their day. And that makes total sense to me, right? Like a lot of people just don't have the time to sit
God,
and
I
watch.
really have to start doing that for my shows. Jesus, I really
I
do.
know.
This is
I need to do it
ridiculous.
way
Why
more
haven't I
too.
been doing this? Fail.
Because
Play
it's
the
work,
gong
Sina.
sound, Jay. Play the gong sound, Jay. The gong of failure. I demand the gong. Gong is life. Where is it? Give us the gong of failure. Thank you. Wait.
What happens when this thing collapses?
There you go, Sina.
Thank you.
But yeah, and obviously I don't have the soundboard thing that a good podcaster does, right? To just be able to like push the little fucking things that you want. I don't even remember what we were talking about.
No, you were talking about like the clips, shortness, like short people, because people talk about the issue around short clips and what they're doing to us. And that's been one of the things that I've been resisting posting more engaging social media. I don't know. I feel like I don't want to get in a situation where I have an audience of people only watching the short thing, because I feel like that gives people an excuse to not listen to the rest, that like I'm part of like the soundbite culture. And that's what part of what our shows should train you to do, is to resist soundbite culture, like resist like, oh, hot take culture is my hot take, here's my hot take, like and now we have the situation where you have like people with like just an army of vapids with nice production studios, right? The most glaring one was that OnlyFans like racist chud Zionist who was like recording with her legs wide open. Like this is a moment where like the ruling class creates media to lure us in, to keep us watching. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's not that it's the attention is short. It's the opposite. It's that it's for extended hours of hanging out with someone. But what they want is us to like not go outside and not touch grass and not form communities, to only connect with these people through your phone, through your screens, because that's the safest way for them. That's the way they know we don't revolt, we don't burn stuff down, we don't stop, like, and we're always going to be consuming the stuff that goes to their house. So like, it's the rentierism of our economy. It's inside our brains, right? They rent out our brains. They're extracting our attention by the minute, like every morsel they can get, and anything they can do to keep us going, anything, like any crazy. And I am a straight man. Okay. What that means is the moment I log into an app, a whole series of very attractive women get thrown at me telling me something. Right. Like, and they know that I'll fall. Like, I'll know that I'll watch. Be like, oh, okay. I guess I'm watching that now. Like, they know that it works on me because hamster brain, right? Like when you get in hamster brain mode of like going online, that stuff gets to you, but then you realize over day in, day out, the toxicity of that. And this is the point we reach now where you have a president who is profoundly unpopular. 1/3 of the country likes him and has only ever liked him. He's never really cracked more than that because of the broken nature of the American political and media sphere, he was able to worm his way into like the elite tier and is doing immense amount of damage from the inside. I mean, sometimes I think like there's a famous quote, I think who said it once? Someone said like Paul Wolfowitz is an Iranian agent. Sometimes I think Donald Trump is an Iranian agent for like all that he's done to help accelerate the decline. It's like that tweet that went viral of like the Chinese guy with the evangelical dad. He said he was chosen by God to bring down, Trump was chosen by God to bring down America. And it's increasingly looking so that that's the way. But here's the thing, Americans brought down themselves by voting for this guy. Americans brought down themselves by letting Zionists take over every single square inch of their lives. They almost murdered those kids on UCLA campus, for God's sakes. Right there, we filmed it. Nobody got in trouble. Like nobody, it was like a thing on LA local news for a few days. Oh my God, this, that. And then they dropped it. Because it's okay to potentially murder little Billy and Chrissy on the floors of UCLA because Zionists said so. Like that's a situation where people see that and like they can hide that. Like they can hide that. They can paper it over and they'll still say, oh, UCLA is still the most popular university, 50,000 applicants every year. Fine. But bro, like that video will always be there. That's like a Kent State. That's a Kent State that you're going to have to sit on, but they'll ignore it and libs won't say it. They'll still send their kids. So I just think at this point, Americans have decided that, okay, you got to nuke something. It's like Nelson. They've become like the Nelson months of late capital. They're like nihilistic. They don't resist their ruling class. They're literally eating your babies, guys. When is the time to revolt against them? I mean, I'm one to talk. I live in the West as if I don't live as part of this machine too. This sort of fake distance we have inside this like resource bubble called Canada is fake at the end of the day. That like if the US wanted to be imperialist with Canada, which it might one day, it could, and Canadians would not do very well. Like they would take Quebec, they would take Alberta, they would destroy Toronto, occupy Ottawa, they'd cross the river, like it would be over. Like so I just feel that like where does this passivity come from? Where the face of all of these crimes of the ruling class and the fact that Americans are the most armed populace on the planet. And Yemenis are second only to Americans, I will say. But like, see what Yemenis do with their guns and see what Americans do with their guns. Americans shoot their own people, their family members, their wives, their husbands, their children, their neighbors, strangers who come to their door, knocking on their door for some random thing. They shoot them. Like Yemenis liberate their country with it, right? And so like I'm at a loss of like what to do with the West. I mean, thankfully, the Iranians have solved a big problem for us, which is rapidly make the West irrelevant to the world and tilt it towards Asia. But we still live here. Like, I'm not going to go move to Iran anytime soon. And so it's a problem of like where, like you tell me, Jay, like why aren't people more radicalized in the US? Like you're American, like you grew up there. I mean, I spent 15 years there, but I was in California and that's a different country than the rest of the country. And I was like cloistered off into like a corner of the academic world. So what the hell do I know? But I'm curious though, and maybe the chat can chime in too. Like how did Americans get so defeated in any of this? Like they couldn't stop any of this. There hasn't been one major anti-war protest in any of this. It's insane.
I don't fully have, I'm still looking for answers to some of that. I do think that look, plenty of people are radicalized within the United States. They're just not on the left at all, right? Like, so I think this is I grew up among, basically like white separatists, like, militias that would go into the fucking woods heavily armed and occupy federal lands. Like that's not And nobody did anything about it, right? Because it was like nobody's going to confront those people, like they will kill you, right? So like there's a lot of that around the country in different places where you still have, heavily armed, heavily trained, ex-military, forces that are prepared for combat, right? But their set of like politics and desires are fairly narrow, right? Like and are I mean, obviously, like revanchist and that kind of stuff. But I mean, somebody made the point, somebody on the right, this was like a Twitter, I don't even remember the interaction, right? But they were like, well, to call them revanchist is wrong because they're in power now, right? And it's like, well, like somewhat, right? But they're not actually in power, right? They think that they are, right? And maybe that's the, what stops those folks from revolting is this kind of like, even as they see Trump be this sort of weird, like they didn't vote for the Zionism, right? Those people, the white militia separatists or whatever,
Yeah, they don't
know,
care.
no. And they would look at something like Iran and say, well, what the fuck? Like, why are we doing this? This is stupid American lie, like whatever. Like we should be focusing on issues here, this kind of thing. But they don't have any kind of revolutionary political horizon, right? It is almost in some ways like, in my view, and no, like, well, I don't mind disrespecting, but yeah, it's like Mad Max to some extent, right? Like that's kind of their vision. Their vision is like Terminator, Mad Max, like of where the world is going, Predator 2. Like their brains are sort of wired. I mean, there's younger generations, so there's probably different cultural resonances to them than the people of my generation that got involved in that kind of stuff. But they are kind of preparing more for the race war, right?
Wow.
Than
That's what
anything
it is.
else.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're preparing
Racism.
for Islam to come here, right? And so this is also
Sharia
the,
law.
like, yeah,
Sharia
all
law.
that.
It's like chai tea. You said the word twice. That means double the power.
Yes,
Sharia
exactly.
law.
Exactly.
Just call it Sharia. It's fine.
And so that's where American radicalization in the last 50 years has gone largely.
Yeah.
And there is a left of sorts. It's very disorganized. The largest organizational manifestation of it, we have to be quite honest, in numerical terms, it is the DSA, right? And the DSA is a big tent organization that has, people who are just liberals, right? People who are like social democrat, like the Breaking Points crowd that you referenced earlier, right? Is their kind of media ecosystem in their form of politics. And then there are more radical folks that are in the DSA. I mean, I encounter them. I'm sure you do as well. Like people who, are part of the international committee or, part of one of the commie caucuses or whatever else. And that increasingly is under attack. I mean, that's under attack, I think, from within the DSA. It's obviously under attack from within the Democratic Party, and it's under attack from the right now, which is also one of the things I was talking about that is somewhat politically interesting is what happens in the next 3 to 5 years, because there is a concern right now about radicalization in the United States, right? And this is being targeted in a number of ways. And I mean left radicalization in this instance. It's being targeted through the attacks on universities, which is taking multiple forms. And it has a lot to do, of course, with the student intifada and not making sure that they don't want that to ever happen again. But of course, this is a much longer project of the right. It's a project that university administrators themselves have participated in heavily, wanting to get rid of the humanities and reduce the costs and all of this. They're now basically using sort of the pretext of the student intifada to say that they don't want international students in the United States at all. And that, of course, is an existential threat monetarily to a lot of universities because they don't have any other way to pay for themselves except
It's
through
the
international
bicycle
students.
meme. It's like putting a stick in your own bicycle
Yeah.
wheel meme at a societal
But
level.
But the right understands that and is okay with it. Like you raised the question earlier of people getting dumber or like this, that's an intentional project. You mentioned that too. Like they want us all to be dumber. There and I mean that goes back Reagan and his person talking about an educated populace, educated proletariat is dynamite, that kind of stuff. That's been a project of the right for the same 50 years, whatever, since neoconservatism and Reaganism and all of that. And I think it's close. Like I think you talked about media collapse. Like there is also, and I think they're very related, this educational collapse that's taking place. And AI is also another component of this that is very intentional. And it's amazing to me. It's sad, and it's a good indication of how poor political education is among a lot of people. The number of educators that are welcoming AI into the classroom, into and I mean, some of it is hard. It's hard to fight at this point because you're just dealing with technology that is, and I should say, so-called LI, language learning models, all that kind of stuff. Not it's not HAL, from to make another 2001 Space Odyssey reference in the same podcast. But
We're such boomers, man. It's embarrassing.
so we are boomers, and yeah, I'll just bracket that. We can come back to AI and education and all of that stuff, but just to say, yeah, that education is in collapse along with the media system, which a lot of people probably say is good. I mean, and I might to a certain extent, but it's very concerning of like, where is the organizational forces that are going to replace this with something good? That's the question, because obviously they want everything to get worse. And yeah, shoving the stick in the bicycle is absolutely right. But to the boomers point, I said this a couple times, so people probably hear me repeating myself, which is very boomerish of me. But it was a reflection recently. It came from seeing a Wonder Years meme. So I follow a lot of these like accounts that are like sort of millennial misery and 80s and 90s, like
Insta?
I have a bunch.
Instagram?
Yeah, there's a bunch of millennial dads, right? And we're in chat groups with each other, right? And we share this stuff around. And it was like the Wonder Years debuted in 1988, and it was, or 88 or 86, right? And it was looking at 1966. And it was like, if this was to debut today, it would be about 2006. And, here we are, and you and I have mostly been talking, as we do on the Imperial 80s all the time, about stuff that happened in the 80s and 90s. And it's like actually insulting a little bit to boomers to say, to compare ourselves to that. We're like fucking Tom Brokaw, talking about the Great Depression and World War II. Like that's where like we're like 20 years more. Boomer nostalgia that we grew up about was actually not about a period that was very long ago.
No. Well, that's what's so funny about Ready Player One. Like Ready Player One, like it's 2000, like something 35 or something, or it's 50 something. I can't remember. But like it's he's obsessed with the 1980s. It would be like being obsessed with like the 1930s. Like, can you imagine? Like, I know everything about Al Jolson. Like, no one cares. But like, yeah, that nostalgia impulse is a sign, I think, of a wider decline, and also a kind of it's a trick, I think, that it's a trick. I mean, yeah, it's easy to say that, oh, we don't make anything new, we just look back and whatever. But it's also which is partially true, I think. But I think it's also that it's a trick that they pull, that the culture industry pulls on us, where they say that, oh, you like this thing 30 years ago, you have kids now your kids will like this thing, and the thing you like too. So you can watch the new thing and the old thing. Now you got two things. And instead of having one thing that was just your thing and that you grew out of, now you get to re-experience it over and over again. Like the first movie I've seen in the movie theaters for a very long time, I went, I saw the Spider-Man movie. I did not pay. Someone paid me. Someone paid my ticket. It was my son. He's my son. Of course, you guys want to meet my son? Should we do a son reveal? You guys will be very confused, but we'll do a son reveal. It was my son's brother, which I guess is also my son. He's not my son, but my son's brother. He bought a bunch of tickets, and I went, and I realized that I hadn't seen the previous two. It made no difference to me how I enjoyed the movie, or three movies exactly, and I fell asleep during the movie theater. And I left the movie theater with a headache and like a migraine, and I missed half of it. I didn't pay. And I was like, I want to go home and sleep. I have a backache. And I was like, bro, you are old. Like you got old. And then you realize that, oh, like culture industry is a young man's game, largely. That like it's a young person's game. That keeping, and because I asked my son, I said, oh, do you know this? And he can give you like a Wikipedia entry of like, oh yeah, and then he does this, and then Thanos did this, and then he did this with this thing, and then whatever. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, my brain has like left the building as he's talking about this stuff. But I realized that, oh yeah, I don't care because first of all joy has been sucked out of my life since the genocide. Let's be real. But also it's that that as you grow up, I feel that this stuff is alienating, that it does, you see through it and you see that like, oh, this is like slop. Like this is more slop. And especially now the slop is not even self-contained, and it's not even enough to go to the movie theater and pay for the ticket. The slop has to follow you around into your life. The slop has to be on the cup. It has to be a poster behind you, and you have to talk about it. You have to do a review about it on your podcast, which is all about slop. Like that, this is the cultural world we live in that's all encompassing. And then it's really like something that actually Ta-Nehisi Coates said on a show that I produce on the MacDizzy Street show. He said this kind of like as a throwaway comment, but he said, yeah, Americans are provincial. Like Americans are just provincial. Like they're not interested in the world. And that's I think is a basic fact in all of this, that they're not interested in the wider world around them. And in fact, I would say most Americans don't even care about most other Americans and most other places in the US, because at the end of the day, how are you in, Inland Empire, Riverside, California, and the Inland Empire? Or whatever. Is it the Inland Empire? I don't remember. But you're sitting in Riverside, California. You're not thinking about Topeka, Kansas. Topeka, Kansas doesn't exist for you. However, Topeka, Kansas is connected to you economically, materially, politically, linguistically. But that gap between you and Topeka, Kansas is so vast. And we also like forget that like countries as big as the US are not real. Like they're not like, these are new entities. Like countries that are vast, like the size of like Canada and the US are like what? China, Iran, less so. Iran's pretty big, mind you. It's a huge country, 900 million square kilometers or something, crazy number. But China's huge and Russia's huge. But the thing is, those countries have had solid, real cultures for thousands of years. They've had cultural roots. They have deep roots, in fact. We, on the other hand, we are products of a settler colonial project that was launched 500 years ago, that really only got going in terms of setting down roots 250 years ago. In where I live, it was 150 years ago.
Yeah.
And these are brand new. And a lot of that you have to import. You have to conglomerate all of that European Euro trash humanity into one. You have to teach everybody to speak the same language. Every Italian, whatever, like this is like the story they always tell with, oh, Little Italy, 1920s, New York, everybody was speaking Italian. Guess what? None of those people's descendants speak Italian. They're all dying. The last people of those like Italian migrants that we fetishize as like the perfect migrants, which is like a thing that like, because they're white, but also because like they have like the Mediterranean thing, I think. Like I want to do an episode about this, the fetishization of Italians in the West, because this is like something that I've seen, but it's more that takes time to set up roots. And I'll say it again, that like one of the best things that ever happened in my life was getting to know Nick Estes and getting involved in making that show, because it opened me up to a whole I don't know, like a whole vast archive of critique and thinking and history. And it just disrupted my world so profoundly to think that, bro, Zionism is not just Zionism. Zionism is everywhere. Zionism is a project all around you. So this is this is something for me that I've started to think about, that like, how did we get to the point where we're all speaking English? Like, how did we get to this situation where this cultural, this Hollywood thing can really hook itself into us, where I'm this Iranian guy from God, I was born thousands of miles away. My life is completely different. And here I am, enjoying the minutia of some stupid, like Hollywood thing. Like this is something artificial in my life. Like I should be like, this is the nativist argument, but I'm increasingly succumbing to it, because like there just is nothing for me in this country. Like there's nothing for me. There's no culture here that I like. In the West, like the West is a failed project, and we are its conscripts. We are conscripts of this Westoid project. And one thing you have to do as a conscript is take the grenade they give you, pull the pin, and hopefully you're in the vicinity as of many of your own commanders as possible, and then you drop it. I'm speaking metaphorically, YouTube. Please don't kick me out of the YouTubes. I'm speaking metaphorically. But it's more that like that's part of what I'm beginning to realize, that like we do have to blow up this culture figuratively. We do have to like explode the basic premises of how we discuss our identities, our language. Like I'm just going to become like a French and Indian wars guy from now on. Like I'm going to close this podcast and I'm going to open a new podcast, and it's going to be the 7 Years' War and the French-Indian War all day long, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like we're going to do, I don't know, was it Braddock or something? Who was the big defeat? I don't remember. But all this stuff has been swirling in my head of like, how did we get here? And I've also been going to Montreal for this project. And I then went to like Quebec City, and Quebec City, this is the roots of North American conquest, was those corners of like the east coast of Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador, whatever. There's still a French island out there, Saint-Pierre and something, Massa something, I can't remember, which I just learned about, by the way, that the French still have an island colony off the coast of Canada. Like, what the hell? And then you realize that, the English still have a colony. It's called Canada. It's just renamed and rebranded under the West. But like, this is the thing, like when you don't see that, when you naturalize that as something organic, then you think that, like this is normal. This is normal to have an empire based around racial supremacy of like one group of people, right? I think someone in the chat said it earlier, that said like, what is it about Americans? Why don't they get radicalized? And really, the answer is racism. Racism fixes the problem, all these contradictions. And really, the fact that Zionists were able to, as the most racist people to ever exist, I really believe that. I really think Zionism has achieved something unique in terms of theorizing racial supremacy. That is a project that we'll be untangling this for a very long time. Products to beat. Thank you. It's like this. We'll be thinking about this for a long time. How it is that Zionist racial supremacy and how their all these different forces came together. Evangelical Christianity, white supremacist, anti-indigenous sentiment, like genocidal anti-indigenous sentiment, Islamophobia, right? Anti-Arab, anti-Asian sentiment. All of these things come together. Euro supremacy, right? How it then combined with, and fused together with the remnants of the Soviet Union, the most reactionary elements of the Soviet Union, by the way, right? Who like migrated there in the 80s and the 90s. So this is, and then we reached its pinnacle, as Feed Me Seymour just brought out, in 9/11, which was a kind of curtains up moment. I think someone said that in a chat of a global world war, right? The U.S. started a world war when it invaded Afghanistan. It's easy to say it planted there, but maybe you could say, you could really say it's 91 in Iraq, right? You could say that it's the occupation of northern Iraq, the no-fly zone. Like, how you bookend the beginning is kind of whatever at this point, but the end is like now. Like, this is the end of the bookend. Like, the U.S. empire ain't coming back from this. Like, this is a fact. Like, someone said in the chat earlier, America is not defeated. It's not that America is defeated. It's that America's way of war is now defeated. And if it can't do war in that way, if it can't break Iran, a country like Iran, in the way that it was supposed to, as a nuclear superpower, with the help of another nuclear power, Israel, with the backup of other nuclear powers in the form of NATO, that if it wasn't able to even crack the surface of Iranian resistance, then what's the point? What was the point of all of this? So they could bully Venezuelans? It looks increasingly so, that they can terrorize Latin America, at least to a point. But even then, how long will that work? How long will the Latin American puppets stay in power when the US is collapsing so hard? I mean, Japan is going through a massive currency crisis, and the US has to float the yen, I think. Is that the term, chat? Float? It's like, it's basically supporting the yen in the hopes that Japan doesn't sell off its US Treasury bonds. I mean, we're at that stage of imperial cope. And yet, this doesn't crack the news and whatever and all this stuff. So I don't know. It's the racism thing is the key. A lot of this, though, that like racism, not just anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, but just the formation of a white supremacist global alliance and its subsumption under the name the West is something that has been like a 500-year-long process that we will have to spend a long time distancing, way past our lives. Right. But the fact that, say, like, why I've been to go back, like why I'm so interested in these wars of the 18th century, because in a lot of ways, like the world we live in now, like the Western world you and I live in now, was determined in those fights, in those wars. Like, why aren't we speaking French? Right. And why, and then it raises all kinds of questions for me about like, why did the French mix with indigenous people the way and not Brits, for instance? Like French people did that way more. Like we have a whole mixed group. They're called Métis, that are like mixed French and native, right? But it's complicated, mind you. I'm not doing a very good job explaining all of this, but it's more that, and I'm more pointing back to the fact that Zionists don't mix with the indigenous people that found on their land. They make it a point of expelling them and killing them and separating themselves from them and isolating them, raising themselves up above them. And this is simply an anachronism. Like, I will not forget the moral question. Forget it. I'm not talking about morality or ethics or anything. I'm just talking from a strict viewpoint of power. When you rule with your racial supremacy, you are kicking your own future in the ass. You are saying to yourself, we have no future here. We have no future here. We're going to have to keep importing our racialized subjects from outside, fill them with the same ideas, replicate them, and keep them growing. It's like a garden or like a forest that can't sustain itself, that has to constantly bring in saplings and seedlings from outside nurseries. And it just feels that way. That it's so anachronistic. It's so anachronistic. Zionists can't even do imperialism properly. And partly it has to do with the nature of their own community formation, which is their own racial, largely, if not entirely, their racial supremacy is their community formation. It's not like, that's the thing, it's their relationship to the people who are not like them, right? That they even have a term for them, goyim. Like, what would it be like if Iranians had a word specifically for non-Iranians? That would be weird, that you use all day long. Like, that would be weird. Like, I guess we have ajnabi, which is Arabic, which means foreigner. But really, it's like this. It's not. I don't think ajnabi is the same thing as goyim, because goyim has this own specific religious aspect to it, and I just simply don't see that. I simply don't see that. The lands that Zionists occupy were diverse places. They multilingual, multi-ethnic. They were mixed with people, Armenians. Like, there were all kinds of people who came in after the genocides. Like, these are things that are bigger than your own dreams of yourself. But Zionists, that's not good enough for them. It's not. It's more important for them to be racist than to have a sustainable project. And that's something I've learned in all of this. That racism is so important to the Western colonial subject that it will be the basis. Now, I don't think that Zionists, like what Zionists do individually, is that new compared to, say, like 18th and 17th, 19th century settlers, like burning across the continent. But like, it's more that they stayed in that mode. They never progressed right out of that mode of naked racial lust and violence. They stayed in that mode and, in fact, got deeper into it instead of realizing that, hey, this racial supremacist project isn't going to serve us. Maybe we should combine with these. Like, of course, they'll never do that because that's not what Zionism is. It's like if my grandmother was a bike, if my grandmother had wheels, she would be a bike. Like that's not what they are. So this is something that I've been thinking all about, of like mixing and cultural supremacy, right? Like how theology informs all of this, and media swirls around all of this. Because media and hearing these things and feeding these things, I mean, look up and down this chat. We have a bunch of people who are like, I have something to say about that. I feel a certain way about that. Like, people feel included in this conversation, even though they're having their own conversation to the side of my screen. I'm not responding to anything they say, really, which is actually maybe one reason why people like Hassan so much, because of the interactive nature. I think that's that model of streaming. Anyways, that was a big long rant, but this is something that, like, every night I like try to find a new book on this stuff, or like I'm just going nuts with all this stuff, or rereading kind of what I have. And it's just still so shocking to me that it took me until 2026 to think about, or 25 really, to think about, say, 18th century wars in Canada and how they infuse themselves, or how did, say, like, because remember, it also, like, they won the French, like the Brits won the French Indian Wars, right? They won, right? It was a victory, but they lost the US 15 years later, right? Less than a decade and a half later, it was gone, right? The imperialist model that got them there, and it didn't work, because in the end they couldn't keep it, because the people who were doing their bidding, like the project itself, they didn't care about Mother England. They didn't care. They were like, that's a whole ocean away. What's that got to do with us? We're just going to set up a new thing.
Yeah, and that's where the comparison to Zionism comes in, and is interesting. I mean, I think that there's this book written by these historians, Rolston and McVeigh, in Ireland, where they, it's similar to kind of studies around Palestine that and Israel, and the Zionist entity, that think about these as laboratories, right? And that language sounds really gross, of course, but like, just think about studying the way that empire studies techniques through settler colonial projects, right? And the kind of experimentation and learning and share of information that happens. And I think, like, but one of the things that they point out, and I'm sure that other scholars have pointed this out, but it just resonated with me reading it, partly out of my own interest in my own Irish heritage and stuff like that. But, like, is that that there is this relationship. I'm sure Indigenous people talk about this. I'm sure, probably, I've never really gotten into Patrick Wolf. He probably talks about this as well. But the relationship between the settler and the metropole, right? And the metropole thinking in this instance of the backers, essentially, of that. And this idea that the settler always sees itself as out in the wilderness with the savages, and needing to do things and operate in ways that people in the metropole are just not comfortable with, because their lives are more comfortable and more cosmopolitan and more liberal in certain ways, right? And they're not comfortable in doing it themselves, right? And sometimes they also it makes them uneasy, right? Or they're not comfortable even authorizing it in certain ways, like publicly. But they also don't really have a problem, right? So, like, the settler go off and do its thing, and obviously there was a war fought, in terms of the so-called American Revolution or counter revolution, or however people want to think about it. But that dynamic is fairly consistent across settler colonial projects, right? I mean, you see it with, the British Empire basically coming to the conclusions at certain points, particularly after the American Revolution, not really in that instance, but, with later on, of like, okay, well, we need to, like, ease this a little bit, and allow for these certain types of, they have their white dominions that they called them for a while. And then there's all of these transitions that they have. And it's kind of what you were talking about with Canada, right? Because Canada fits very interestingly into that because there is no war fought, right? And it's also, I think, in part why there's somewhat of a different relationship. I mean, granted, it's also less genocidal in like but I think that's also related, right? Because you don't have a situation where the settlers totally broke free and just went on a rampage, right? Which is what happened in America, so-called United States, right? Is that because they were able to secure their, you know, whatever freedom from the UK and from the British, right? They were like, oh, well, now we can do whatever the fuck we want, right? And that's similar to the mentality of Zionists very much, right? It's like, yeah, you all do support us in these different ways, but you're not going to tell us what to do. You don't understand what our lives are like. You don't understand what it requires to maintain this thing. And I also think you talked about like it hasn't I don't know the right word, but like moderated, like Zionism hasn't moderated itself in the same way or whatever as like, I don't know. Do you want to say that again?
I said that it hadn't progressed, which is not the right word, but it's like past this point of pure racial violent lust. Which that's the thing, like that, which I also will say that like Canada does have that same genocidal project. It doesn't unfold in the same way. And it doesn't like there are residential schools in Canada. There are a lot of the same elements are there for sure. And I don't think that's not what you intended to say at all. I think it's slightly it is different. Because I mean, and partly has to do, I think. Now I need to consult. Like most of my reading of like native historians are ones based in the U.S. I need to now take seriously some real Canadian, some ones based here, and to think about. I think that look the role of the French in how the project unfolded in Canada on this side of the country in those early years did have a role. And so, like for instance, like after the Brits won in the 1750s or whatever, they didn't go and racially cleanse the French. Right, like they didn't. First of all, they couldn't. There's too many of them. Like the French speaking, because there was a lot of them, but because they just didn't do that. They couldn't do that. So that's why we still have to this day the province of Quebec, which, by the way, is one of the richest and largest provinces, both by area and by people. So it's not like the project of Franco, like of sort of French, the ghost of French imperialism, French settler colonialism still lives in Canada. And it's still, it's still a project of erasure. But I do think that a prime difference is this is like to think about mixing. Mixing is something that empires have to do if they want to continue in the future. The Brits like had a whole Anglo-Indian class. Now, they weren't racially mixed. Those were white people, but they were like raised by, like brown labor. Like Rudyard Kipling grew up Anglo-Indian. He was born in India to English parents. And the sort of model back then, at least in the sort of late period, was, okay, you raise them until the age of whatever, and then you ship them back to the metropole to get their education so they cannot be too brown and whatever. Right. But it just makes me think of like that, unfortunately, people were like making too much of that, like of this guy. There was that, I don't know if you saw it. It was a little meme too, that Norwegian guy who got stuck in India somewhere. So he's like this big Norwegian guy. He's white and he has this like Indian accent and he sounds Indian. Like that is a story. That's like an exceptional thing. That's like kind of like a historical oddity. But this was the project of imperialism. These people in the 18th, 17th, 16th century came over by boat. Like some of it was sailboat, and they imagined themselves. They arrived to a place with millions of people who are not like them, and they had to ask their help to continue living. Like how many? I always make this joke that the Red Nation people. There's all these stories of like some settler village in New England that gets a disease or starvation, a bad winter crop. They all die off. There's like one kid left, little Jimmy. and like some indigenous people come and across them and like pick them up as one of their own and adopt them, like whatever. That's part of the story of why indigenous people also survived through the genocide and before the genocide, is that they weren't fixated on their own racialization. They would accept newcomers. They would accept newcomers into their old fold. Was it always peaceful and loving and not violent? No. Was it like not imbued with its own ideas about whatever? But racialization wasn't the centerpiece of their politics, right? It wasn't, not like that, not the way that Western and like Europeans travel with their racial politics. So, I said this to you, and I think in our last episode, I was always like, racial capitalism. What does that even mean? Just say capitalism, like and then I realized that like without the technology of racialization, without the mental technology that is, and how that gets imbued into a political project, baked in, as Nick loves to say, who's listening to this now, by the way, who's cleaning. Nick, I love you. Nick. Shout out to Nick Estes. The gong of life goes for him. But like that's been one of the sort of journeys that I've taken on in these 7 years of producing the Red Nation podcast, is like being exposed to this immense rich culture of critique, of scholarship, of all these people who are working to sort of uncover this history that's been buried one layer after another to kick it up and sort of like look at it and think about like, okay, this is how they prosecuted their genocide to us, and we can see the remnants of that and how they exist today, and how the current geopolitical situation in Palestine is reflective of our own histories. Like, this is what indigenous people and critique taught me. And it's heartening and also so depressing to think that like I spent years reading British history. Years, brother. I cannot tell you how many books I read about British history.
I'm so glad I didn't have that life.
Oh, brother, it is like, it's embarrassing. But that's the thing. I never once considered Canada, the US. I never thought about how their own artificiality is reflected in their histories, and to consider that. It's just, I don't know. Anyways, thanks.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point. And like, so a few things that you addressed, I just wanted to note, but like the slop thing around like Marvel and the movies and all of that, and it extending into all of these different spheres. This is why I don't actually, I don't fully see what I see is a decline of the old model of what media look like. But this like global slop machine, to me, it is not determined where that stuff is all going to end up. And they're still trying to figure out, they're still toying with ways to do that. And they, I think the algorithms do a lot for people. Like I think we underestimate the power of the algorithm in everybody's lives, and that most people's algorithms look nothing like yours or mine, Sina. Like, we have to do a lot of work to curate what our algorithm looks like, so that it doesn't look like what the average 17-year-olds does when they open up their cell phone, and the YouTubers that they're recommended and the conversations that they're in, and how devoid most of that stuff is from any kind of politics at all, right? Like, because it just is like, and I'm saying it has politics, obviously, but they're just really deeply embedded in like, we're going into this, it's like an escapism, almost in a pure sense, right? It's like, leave your body, sit in this chair. What was that Disney movie about the kid that gets all fat and watches TV all day in the future?
Up.
I don't
know.
remember.
Not Up. Shit. No, the one on the plane. Wally.
Right? There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, they told us that's what they were trying to do back then, and that's what they're trying to do. To the point on the US not being real, I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the question, I think this is central to the question of also why Americans don't resist. And what's hard for me to reconcile, obviously, is that there have been different periods in which they have. But I think that there are things we need to further understand about what is being done and what has been done to us in the last 20 to 30 years in particular, I think. to understand like what has happened to the anti-war movement, which we can have plenty of critiques, and I have lots of what the anti-war movement was like in the early 2000s with the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions, but it was still there was still a lot of people that were involved in it, right? Like, and that is very different from where we are now on that particular front. Um, I mean, the point about the provincialism is the US, absolutely. Nice name drop for the Makdisi brothers and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Uh, but I grew up in Oregon, right? Which I think is interesting in just thinking about this. It was very recently ethnically cleansed, genocided lands. I grew up, I went to a school that was named after Chief Sam, right? Which was an Anglicization of an indigenous leader's name. Um, the and a lot of the streets where I grew up in were, related to tribes and nations that had been cleansed out of Oregon. And we had to sing our state song. The land of the empire builders, right, was like the first line. We are the land of the empire builders. I think they've changed it because it's not woke enough. But like that was how we were raised. We had to do an Oregon Trail, like a year-long like we didn't just play it like the other kids of our generation. We had to do like a year-long set of projects of learning about the Oregon Trail, right? So there was a lot of this kind of like bootstrapping of this settler culture that we were inculcated with. But it's also, and this is one of the things I've thought about a lot over the years, is that the United States, like national culture, I didn't grow up in a place that, like, I don't remember US national culture that much growing up. I mean, yes, we had TV, and that was like a big part of it. And you would see different parts in the United States on TV. You would see California, you would see New York, see the Cosby Show, this kind of stuff. But the idea, like, it's not just that Americans don't travel outside of the country, which is true. Like, most Americans really do not. And I haven't a ton, but the times that I have, like, most prominent was I spent 6 months in Ireland when I was in college. And that was like, I can't even describe how mind-blowing that was, because when I came back, it was I mean, people have been talking about this lately, of like how depressing it is when you come back to America after going to a real place in the world and you're like, "Oh shit, like this place is fucked." Like we are, it's like those memes that came up from like, it's pictures from the 70s that'll be like a street and it'll just show like all of the different, like, CVS, Burger King, McDonald's, like, you just like, that was the thing that struck me the most profoundly, was how advertised and commodified like everything was within our society, and how even in other countries that are very much um in the circuits of capital, right? Like it just doesn't look and feel the same way at all. You don't feel like, your whole life is revolving around Ronald McDonald or something like that. Um, my friend Brooke talks about this idea of like, as a white person, um, kind of realizing this reality of, you live in this like manufactured and, the settler, the wreckage. He talks about being shipwrecked and like this project of sort of cultural dislocation, right? Which is, I think, also part of what you're talking about too. I mean, at least for people in the United States who are not white, there is something to it kind of try to reattach to, or a project to look to, whether it's like, if you're black, you can look to like Pan-Africanism, or look at, like, just think about these histories. Obviously there's a lot of violence and pain through these stories as well, but there's at least different things to look to. I think white Americans in particular have a very hard time with this because we are not raised to think about ourselves as Europeans. There isn't the mixing. There is this whole racial purity supremacy thing that is just very much pushed among most white folks. But there is a mixing within European descended peoples, which has its own way of also assimilating white people into this blob that is culturally amorphous and meaningless, right? Like, why am I going to go, go back to Ireland or go back to such and such if I am only 20% this and da da da? Like, it just becomes a thing where people then become attached, I think, to that white American identity really strongly because it's like, this is all I have, is sort of the way that they think about it. But it's so recent. I mean, I think about like Dr. CBS's work around the concept of true Americanism. And she's also somebody who's helped me think about the fact that a lot of the even American identity is not even like 1776 shit. It's honestly like a 20th century project, right? It's something that becomes very manufactured because also you had all of that. Even if you go to the early 20th century, you have all these European immigrants who are like radical commies, basically, or anarchists or whatever. They're coming from different places within, being imported as labor, right? And they have their own radical
Marx was
politics.
going to move to Texas. That was one of
Yeah.
his plans because he made good money in New York Tribune. And he was like, I could go to Texas. Everyone's going to Texas. He was going to move to Texas. Imagine Karl Marx in Houston.
Crazy, right? So that even when we think about that American identity and formation of American culture, and when I'm saying that, I mean like thinking about literature and really thinking about these concepts of like what does it mean to be American in a U.S. context. That this had to be like really, it was also done in the academy and it was done through the publishers and so on and so forth. And it's not to say there weren't works earlier on, right? Like James Fenimore Cooper is like really important to this project. Mark Twain becomes important to it in a certain way, so on and so forth. There are things from earlier eras, but they actually had to be brought together and then narrated or like, I don't know, you're actually more the cultural studies scholar, so you could probably talk about this process more, right? But it had to be formed into something that then could be promoted as this is what Americanism is, and these are the American classics, and so on and so forth. And that was an intentional project, and it's really a 20th century project. I do think you brought up 9/11, and I think that's huge. I mean, I think that 9/11 in some ways for me was probably the first time. I mean, I do remember, of course, the Gulf Wars in, the end of the 80s, early 90s, 91, whatever. Um, and I remember, there being opposition. They also, obviously had military success were also somewhat limited, right, in terms of their objectives and what they were actually doing. I mean, you talked about like the foothold that they put in the region and the impact that they had. And obviously the impact on the peoples of that region is profound. I'm not seeking to diminish that at all. But I think in large part, it was thinking about the Imperial 80s, it was a project that was built up over like a decade of the right saying like we need to get over this Vietnam syndrome shit because it's producing all kinds of problems for us and being able to project our imperial hegemony. And so we need a win and we need to figure out some place to do it. And I think in a certain way, Saddam, just represented this opportunity for them that they felt like they could sneak away with pretty easily. But 9/11 is like really important, I think, because that's the first time that I really remember seeing an Americana being like celebrated, which is also interesting. I mean, I think this is also what it was to grow up in the afterlife of Vietnam to some extent. And my mother and my father was a Vietnam like conscientious objector. He didn't participate in the war. He, first burned his draft card, all that kind of stuff. So like I grew up in a family that was oppositional to war and US imperialism, broadly speaking. But so I had a different orientation to that from the beginning. Like 9/11, obviously, for anybody who was around during it, it was a scary day. You were like, oh shit, you called all your relatives. You're like, what's going on? You know, it was something that Americans weren't used to, that kind of thing. But that wasn't the thing. To me, it was the response that was really, really, really scary. Like that was like Nazi shit, you know, like you really
Burning
saw
down like Sikh temples.
yeah, you saw the American Nazi base like just rise and be like, we will crush everybody in the world. Like, we don't care who did it. We don't care. Like, we just gonna go kill a bunch of people. Like, that was the American mentality. And there was also, like we mentioned, like a very large contingent of people who were opposed to the war, who marched, who did that kind of stuff. But it was not a militant anti-war movement. You know, it was much more docile than prior iterations of opposition to US imperialism. Um, and maybe that was tactical at the time. Maybe it was strategic. Maybe people were thinking like this, you know, between the global war on terror stuff, the Patriot Act, all of the stuff that was being rolled out at the time, it's probably true that people on the left were like a little bit afraid of like, if we go really militantly against this thing, like we're going to be crushed as internal enemies, you know? And I think that is a consideration. I think that that is still wielded in certain ways, right? The way that we go after in this country people who, you know, want to show solidarity with Iran or want to, you know,
Yeah,
show
they're never going to
solidarity
let
with.
Calla Walsh back into the country again. Like she can. I don't think Calla, if you're listening to this, don't go back to the U.S. Please, don't go back to the U.S. It's not safe because like you're right. The 9/11 moment was a moment of profound imperialist, reactionary rage and hate, and I will never forget it. It will be kind of like a moment, and even we got it in Canada. It's far away from us, but we got it in Canada, and it's and I just have to always remind yourself that like those people died so millions of other people could die. Like that's the reality of 9/11. So like Larry Silverstein could get his big insurance payout that they don't have to pay for the asbestos repair, which is what they had to do if they didn't bring it down. They just blamed it on Arabs and Muslims, and they used it to wage like a civilizational war that's still going to this day, that is falling on its face now. That's the thing. 25 years later, we're gonna, oh my God, we're gonna have 25 years of 9/11 this year. Oh Christ. It's just it just, that's the thing. Like you can draw a direct line from that moment of rage and of hate and fear, all those things swirling together, to then like doing this crazy thing, invading Iraq, winning, like previous like that too was like Afghanistan too, but like that whole project of encircling Iran with bases, encircling Iran with all these military installations, that like this will like, that was the beginning of it. That was the roots of this. So right now, as it's all falling down, Iran is literally bombing those bases, and that process of imperial expansion. So we're getting an example of what decolonization could look like around the world in West Asia right now. Now, can the other countries in the world pull this off to the way that Iran has? No, probably not. Like sometimes I think maybe Iran could do this because of everything it has. Like it's like the ultimate 5-tool player. It has geography, it has population, it has resources, it has, you know, like military power, and ultimately it has a political system that's independent and sovereign. Like these are rare things in our world, especially when and then even more rare when you combine them together. So you think that like, oh, what could be, like if the US, let's say if Mexico got really radical, right, and this refused to participate in like the American imperial project, like what would a war between the US and Mexico look like? It would be really fucking ugly, first of all, obviously. But ultimately, like there's no hormones for Mexico to control. However, Mexico has a lot of people, and those people are all over the US. So what kind of war would that look like? With, you know, like what if a few of those people decided to be patriotic and do something to like stop the war on their country? Like these are all things like violence, political violence. You know, like poli-sci people will say this, that like violence is a tool for politics, but it's not a stable tool. It doesn't work in the way you want it to work all the time. It works when imperialists do it in a certain context and they win in a way that it doesn't affect them, right? So Afghans couldn't get to the U.S. They couldn't get to U.S. interests when they were fighting. They were just the closest soldiers there. That's all they had, and those people were invisible to the U.S. They didn't care if Donnie Dingleberry from Idaho lost his legs and arms. Like, they didn't care. That was all just horseshit. Americans don't mourn their soldiers because they know what they are. They're stormtroopers for Exxon and BP. Like, that's obvious. So there's like no honorable American fight like to back, and like only the military judge, which are not an insignificant part of the population, which we kind of override. I'm sure you know this, being from the West Coast. The West Coast is the military coast. It's not the East Coast. It's the West Coast. Like, California belongs to the California coast belongs to the U.S. I think Air Force. Like Camp Pendleton is in the U is in San Diego.
San Diego. So I was recently in San Diego, and it was the first time I'd been back there in a long time. And I have, I have family, right, that was in the Navy and then the Marines, right, on my mother's side. And, the last time I had been down there had been to visit them. And I didn't, as a kid, you don't think too much about all of these things. Like, going back there recently, I was like, oh, the reason that they were all down here, is because this is a fucking massive military base. Like, this whole region, like the city, they have, the big naval museum there and all that kind of stuff. And there's just like, there's bases, and there used to be more bases than there are. But like, yeah, it's amazing in that respect. And I have a friend who's down there who tries to organize, shout out to him, tries to organize like Iranian, like anti-war stuff and so on and so forth, and like is principled in how he engages with it. But like, shout out to him for taking that on down there. And it is small, as you can imagine it would be, right? But like, that's the, like, when I came back, I was like, yeah, that's the belly. Like, that's the belly of the belly in a certain way. There are these places across the US where the military basically just owns the cities in certain ways, right? And also, it's not just the West Coast. Like, it's also areas of the South and areas of like the South Atlantic coast and so on and so forth too. And like, areas around like Maryland and Virginia, North Carolina, and so on and so forth, and Florida in certain parts. And there are these different places. It's always near the coast, because they're always thinking about different types of deployment. And when we were in the San Diego airport, there was a bunch of kids. I don't mind saying this. I mean, I'm sure they were 18 or 19 or whatever the fuck, but they're kids that are all like decked out in they had their backpacks and everything. And I'm just thinking, like, you fucking, poor dummies, and I mean, you could say like they should know better and all of that, but there's so many different forms of indoctrination for people that young. I mean, I grew up around folks that joined the military, and, it's just like, look, we grew up watching fucking G.I. Joe cartoons as kids. Like, like, you think that doesn't have some impact in the aspirations of people and what they see as valorous. But you're right in terms of there is no, and the right, of course, deeply resents this, but there isn't really any kind of national mourning of dead U.S. soldiers. And there's not, I mean, 9/11 produced a very specific moment in which there was this appetite for like a bloodlust that was like raised. And I don't know what it would take to regenerate that at this stage 25 years later. I mean, it's scary to think about that and think in those terms. But it would take something very, very substantial, I think, to reinvigorate a kind of mass support for people, for this appetite for people to send their sons and daughters to some type of war, which is why I don't think, I know there's all of the thinking around ground invasion and this kind of stuff.
Never gonna
in
happen.
Iran.
Never
Yeah,
gonna happen.
I knock on wood, but like I can't. That's always been very hard. I would have conversations with Abdul Jawad about this with relation to U.S. maybe involvement against the Axis or Iran, like early on, like post October 7th and all of that. And I just was like, I always have pumped the brakes on those because I'm just like, I remember what that post 9/11 moment was like. And we are so fucking far from that as a society and culture right now, again, that it's really hard to think of in those terms. And so that's interesting in another way, right? I don't see the appetite for resistance in the same way. Although maybe that depends on where you are. Like, I know that, we had a good conversation with Nick about the anti-ICE stuff in Minneapolis. Like, there are these pockets and these moments where something happens within communities where you do see like a bigger jump into forms of resistance to a kind of like fascist project. I just think it's hard for Americans at this stage to imagine themselves doing that for peoples elsewhere in the world, which is fucked. Like we can name that. But I also think that it is related to this, the relationship that we have to violence that's done to others, and like how much media also that we've been inundated with to just dehumanize and also like cartoonify or just create violence that's on such a scale that it's just like totally overwhelms the senses in a certain kind of way and just washes over you, right? What does that do generation after generation to people's ability to kind of just, accept that, yeah, well, of course there's violence in the world. I mean, John Wick just killed 275 people in that movie. Like, what are you talking about? And I think that's
I mean, that's a
remember
big reason why, like, that's, sorry to interrupt, but like that John Wick
No.
thing, you're onto something, because like that's like in a lot of ways, American culture like trains you to be a killer, to normalize this kind of action movie violence and imagine yourself a vigilante, and the grievances of a certain class of people and their fantasies of whatever control get projected to millions, if not hundreds of millions, and because of US cultural power, like billions of people. So billions of people watched Lord of the Rings. Billions of people watched this like insanely racialized narrative of like, oh, here are these darkies choosing the side of the bad guys. Like, they internalized that stuff. They had a bunch of Aryans fighting evil. Like, come on, man. Like, it's not like, and then you watched his follow-up King Kong. I mean, that dude has a race problem. Peter Jackson is a raging racist. Like, he can fictionalize it all he wants. He can deny it all he wants. But the bro has profound racial anxieties that manifest in his movies. And we just eat it up here. They give him 15 trillion Oscars. Like, here you go, Mr. Race Fantasist. Here you go. Here's your little Race Fantasist award. Like, that's something I think that if we can do anything in this world is to chip away at this racial thing, at this racialization project. And in so many ways, Zionists want you to racialize every part of your analysis. They want you to think about everything through a racialized lens. But it's not that you don't want to do that. You want to remove one layer of that, which is not that the race of people is the reason for this, the race themselves. No, it's the racism of a European settler colonial system, that racism that is animated by racism, that is united by racism, whose contradictions that a Norwegian, businessman and a Sicilian farmer and a, I don't know, Portuguese bus driver can all make a home beside each other in New York City or Montreal or LA or Houston. Like that was preceded by his centuries of racialized thinking. So if there's one thing that we can do, and obviously, Jared, this is like one of the central tenets of your project, is to think about racialization, to think about the role of, say, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence to the formation of our identities. And so if there's any more prominent example of that now is watching this genocide. Like we watched a genocide. We are watching a genocide taken, like led by Jews, self-identified Jews who call themselves Zionists, who use Zionism to expedite a racialized project of ethnic cleansing in historic Palestine. Like that's it. They use their own minoritized identity that they imagine for themselves, because Jews have been white for many decades now, at least. They have not experienced structural racism for many, many decades. And when they did, it was nothing like what was experienced by other racialized minorities, by the way, because of the white passing nature of Ashkenazi Jewry. Like these are historical facts. You can shriek about it all you want, Zionists, but the reality is you are part of a white European settler colonial system hinged around the fantasy of racial superiority. Now, here's the thing: instead of using that thinking to a point and then removing themselves from it or separating themselves from it to a certain register and taking it apart and thinking about like, okay, that's probably not a good thing. Maybe we should integrate our schools. Like maybe we should mix our sports teams. Maybe we should, like instead of doing that, they went backwards and they said, oh, no, we do it harder. We do apartheid harder. In fact, we do apartheid, the worst kind of apartheid, which is apartheid with machine guns, which is we're not going to separate ourselves with you from politically. We're going to actually murder you. So this is an interesting, and it's not like this is not like part of the US story. It's that at a certain point, anti-indigenous violence just simply didn't work for the expansion of US imperialism. It just, like Washington's memoirs or whatever, like the bro had to deal with like his own problems on his land, the land of like this swamp land outside of his estate and wherever, Martha's Vineyard or wherever his house was. Like these are local problems. Racists don't deal well with local problems. They just have racism and they rely on someone else to do that. Usually a racialized person, by the way. Like the irony, of course, and that's the history of slavery. Like it was enslaved Black Africans who were dredging up his lands, who were like building his agricultural empire. If he murdered them out of racial lust, would he be where he was? No, it doesn't make sense. Like if he just straight up murdered them all in the way that Zionists fantasize about of having complete ethnic cleansing, it just wouldn't have worked. There was no labor on the land. It didn't make sense. So that even the fear of it, like even I don't know, maybe I'm pushing too hard on this, but I just think that Zionism has perfected racism or evolved racism. I don't know. Those are the positive connotations, those verbs. I don't want to give them that, but it's the sense that that they've elevated, and again, positive connotations, but they've done something. They've crystallized or extracted. How about that? So much racism that they've reached a new sort of diamond core of race hate. But that diamond core is lethal to themselves and to their own project. They need Palestinians to rule over. They need them. They need them as part of their project. They need to hate them to keep their own community together. But how long does that work? How long does that work for them? It doesn't. It just won't.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is I don't know to how long. It's the thing that so I agree with what you're saying, right? I do think, I mean, I don't know that it's totally unique historically, maybe, but it certainly harkens back, right, to a prior period, I don't know if it's like Rhodesia or if it's, the US South I don't know, around 1920 or, or if it's Nazi Germany, it's all of these things. It is in that echelon and that pinnacle of forms of racism that are really, really volatile, right? Because, and it's interesting, right? In particular, maybe the distinction between a lot of those other periods, I don't know where Nazi Germany would fall in this, but between a lot of those other periods
that's a good example actually. of a self-destructive racism.
Yeah. Is that at least if you go far enough back, the racism wouldn't have been that abnormal, right?
Yeah.
So like other European countries would be like, yeah, we deal with our fucking racial colonial projects like slightly differently, but we all hate these fucking people,
Yeah,
right?
we
Like
feel the same hatred
we
towards
feel
them
the
that you do. Yeah.
right. We have some different, approaches to trying to manage it, but like we're here for the supremacy of our people over the rest of the world and so on and so forth. I mean, that sentiment is still there among segments of the population, in Europe for sure, in the United States for sure, in Canada, etc. But it is not, I would say it's weaker, much weaker now than it has been, right? Like there are a lot of liberals who are racist for sure in their own ways, but are more in line with what you're talking about of like, I mean, so I just saw the Odyssey. We did the thing on it yesterday. Christopher Nolan's another guy, by the way, in that Peter Jackson school of fucking fascist, racist pieces of shit. But his example is one that still works for a lot of liberals, which is like we'll put Lupita Nyong'o as Helen. We'll bring in Travis Scott to bang the stick at the beginning of the thing. You know, and so it's like a diversification, which of course pisses off the right because they're like, the Greeks are all fucking white dudes who look like me. It's like, no, stupid. But that diversification project, right, is the kind of liberal version of this, right? To say, hey, we're all going to do conquest together and we're all going to like do these things, but you can come with me as long as you play your role and as long as you assimilate in a certain way and so on and so forth, which again, to your point, is not something Zionism is willing to do. At least Zionism requires at minimum, right, that well, we need a very ridiculous apartheid system that's heavily militarized, and we need to constantly just blow people up around us. Like these are just our basic, baseline level of racism is you have to accept those things as like non-issues all the time. And we have the ongoing ethnic cleansing of their land, right, and steal more of it every single day and displace people from their houses and all that kind of shit. That baseline is incompatible at this point with where most of the world is. I do believe that. Like historically, no. And there's plenty of cultural resonance that Zionists can seek out through different societies of saying, well, you did this, you did this, you do this, but as just like a baseline every day, like most people look at that and are like, you are retrograde, like 19th century, 17th century, like racists. This is not, like you said, I don't know if it's perfected. It is the reactionary. It is this like look to this past. It is that it is like a historical.
It's a crystallization. I should have said that.
Yeah. And like, this is what's interesting. This is an interesting thing, Sina, though, is that the number. So the Democratic Party and like mainstream liberals in the US, I think, are a really interesting thing to examine in relation to this, right? Because they are still, for the most part, more comfortable, right, with funding that and with not wanting to alienate their, you know, serial killer brained Zionist friend than they are to supporting Palestinians. And so this is like such a incoherent thing for me. I mean, it's not necessarily incoherent when you look at the history of liberalism, right? If you look at like Lucerdo and so on and say, okay, well, liberalism has always been comfortable with colonization, with settler colonialism, with imperialism, with like this, but it is interesting in this particular moment, like, George Floyd was murdered 6 years ago. And, you saw like so much liberal joining of forces with different people of like whatever. I mean, I know this is very surface level stuff, right? But like the number of Black Lives Matter signs and things and all of that is not meaningless. Like millions of people were brought into consciousness around certain issues that they, previously were blind to, or just not really blind to, but like didn't, again, like just put it over here, don't think about it, watch Marvel, like whatever. Um and like I think it's easy for us to be quite cynical looking back at that moment, but there were people in the streets, like taking to the streets, burning things down, police station went up in flames. The burning down of the police station had a higher approval rating than what was it, funding police departments or something like that at the time. I mean, it was crazy in terms of some of the things, if you just look at like how the populace as a whole felt around things. Obviously, the right mobilized against that strongly. The Democrats have fully retreated against the sort of defund and all of these kind of things that came out of it in terms of the ways people were moving politically. But the what's fascinating to me is that there is this weird overlap, and maybe it's not, because maybe most of the people who were mobilized by that are more in the kind of, they're not necessarily in the DSA, but they make up like the voting base that would elect these politicians right now, who are, I know we both would have our critiques of them in many forms, but like are willing to say like we shouldn't be supporting Israel, we shouldn't be sending money to Israel, like we don't need to have an institutional relationship with them, on and on and on. So maybe that's kind of like where that energy is. I think this is also like the passivity point though too, is that like it's interesting to see that stuff happening electorally, and then you're like, what else is going on? Because if you're just investing your energy into like electing a few politicians here or there, like I I'm sorry, like I don't see that becoming some kind of groundswell that's able to change policy in some kind of way. Um, but maybe those are some of the things there. The other thing that you said is like the John Wick point about conducting the violence. And I used to think about it in that way. Like when I watch Rambo or Predator or whatever, is like teaching us to be the perpetrators of the violence. And that is part of it. And but I think they know that that's a smaller segment of the population. And like, that's one of the goals. But I think the other goal is for the rest of us to just sit and watch the violence and get used to watching the violence and doing nothing, right? And I think that is also probably the impulse that worries me more, even with respect to Zionism, right? Is how much our populations, particularly in the imperial core, but even to some extent outside of it, because of how the reach of those kind of movies and that kind of media work, um, how much are they just anesthetized to these forms of violence in ways that m- make it hard to congeal political projects that are going to galvanize against it, right? That's a question for me.
I think that I think with like the nature of the culture industry being what it is right now, that it's like a vector of war and violence and imperialism and racism, like just going straight into our veins. And then there's another vector of trying to make us feel better about the world. So like they feed us with that too, right? So that's why like you have a mix of like, that's why this sort of news culture here is like, okay, it's like, okay, the biggest, bloodiest stories at the beginning, you sort of paper over them, and then you say, okay, local cat opens bank account. Isn't it adorable? Like that's because people want to be entertained. Like entertainment is the primary mode of cultural engagement. It's not connecting people or expanding it's entertainment. Like in German, I love this word in German. It's Unterhaltung, like holding you under. I think we have a German in the chat too. Like it's holding you under. Like that's their word for it, because it's just meant to like pass the time, to get you through that, to get a few more bucks out of you. Like this is how like the primary mode of cultural interaction exists. And the fact that it's like based around like the individual texts and the fandom around them, that like communities form around individual texts. Like, oh, I'm a fan of the Lord of the Rings. You're a fan of Marvel. Aren't we two peas in a pod? Like that's like 80% of American identity right now. Like for people who are like under the age of 30, or like, what's your local sports team? Like these are all very superficial, but because there's nothing deeper, more profound in that culture, that like the cultures that have older histories, that have their own languages, they all get erased. They all get told to fuck off. They got genocided. They get stuffed into boarding schools. Like this, that ongoing violence, which continues to this day, that is like secondary to the project of making our, like more glorious, or whatever, e pluribus unum, right? I mean, that says it itself, like out of many one, right? Like that idea of this unification. But really what that means is like out of many under one bank, like central bank. Like it's an economic project first and foremost, and everything derives from that. So that's why when America fights a big fat war with Iran and it proves to be like useless, like it proves to be like completely useless, it's because that all that war machine was for pumping up stocks, was to like give, the Raytheon VP a third boat. Like that's what it's for. It's not for actually projecting power or doing something with it, because the moment you do it against a country that can withstand it, then you get into a lot of trouble and it hurts you more than it helps you. So I think maybe we should consider winding down, because it's 2 hours, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, how do we continue these conversations? Because I enjoy these conversations, but it just feels like every time we do this, we just like bang our heads against the wall. And maybe that's the point. Like maybe we just do this as an exercise to feel more sane. Like that's probably why people listening to us now still. Some people have been with us for 2 hours, which is hilarious to me. This is like, it's just like, okay, they're listening to us, but it just feels like you have to do these things. You have to bring these to light. You have to ask, like, why is fascism so prevalent in this community or that community? Why does it like take such incredible amount of force to just get one milquetoast social democrat into like a mediocre position of political power, and why he's squished like a bug as we watch, right? Like the Chapo guys, for instance, I'll give you one example. The Chapo guys went balls to the wall for Bernie. The moment, and then they crushed him like an ant. And then the moment that happened, they completely gave up. They left all kinds of political, they just left. I mean, I stopped listening to them, so who knows? But you get the sense of the the bar for nihilism for Americans is very low. That like once something has been taken from them, once a dream balloon has been popped, once they run into some resistance and their project fails, they give up and they resort to like empty nihilism. And that's the thing that like and that's why they went so hard against like the student intifada. That's why they go so hard against communities that don't resist them. I mean, you've done how many episodes on the MOVE bombing? They literally bombed their own cities to stop even a modicum of radical anti-capitalism. Just a modicum. Just a tiny little, you can't allow that. It has to be 100%. And that's where the American Zionist thinking sort of overlaps. That's where you see like, oh, I reckon, like when you see Israelis bulldozing some, martyr's house, you see the connection. Because then you're like, oh, that's to like the older story of like, colonial troops or British troops burning down villages that resisted. Like this is an older project that settlers wage against natives. And that technology is some of the kind of baseline, that's like a kind of baseline politics for a lot of our planet, not the entirety, but for a lot of it. And it's going to keep popping up. And I just feel that until we seriously get a sense of how we can even just begin to bring this to light, that like the stories of like, you have to show liberals the skulls, the buffalo skulls, like just show them that picture. Like that should be on every history classroom. Like the way that they teach certain genocides and not others, like they conveniently erase that. Like they should show the pictures of what American whites did to enslaved Africans. Those are traumatizing. Those stay with you forever. Those lash marks on people's back, those images stay with you. If you're me, at least, they stay with me. I don't know. Maybe other people can resort to that stuff. But I just think that in the last 3 years, we watched something very profound to our political world, to our 500 years of history unfold. I mean, it was definitely like a new version of it, definitely like a way violent and way extremely concentrated version of it, because if the imperialists could wage war like this in the 18th century, that if they could do that, they would have done that, but they couldn't. It was intimate, close contact. It was like you have to literally Amherst has to literally give the what are the blankets? The
smallpox blankets.
The smallpox blankets literally have to give them away to it. Now they can drop, God knows what on Gaza from far away. They can do it. It's nice, clean. But that's the thing, like the Iran war, and maybe I'll close with this, is that Iran denied the US a clean war. And that's what imperialists want. They want clean fighting. It doesn't mean their side doesn't die. Lots of people died in the conquest of the US of Turtle Island. Lots of people, lots of their own people, which is to say, it wasn't like some sort of clean thing. And same with the Brits too. Brits died all over the planet building their empire. But ultimately, they would win. They combined more wins, and then, or at least their wins, or like they would like win, but then sort of lose, or they would reach a stalemate and make a deal. Then they would just break the deal. Then they would just go around the deal. They would deny water to those people. They would kick them off their land. Like that's how they win after the fact. And like genocide is the basic operation of that project. But the fact that Israelis are so dedicated to enacting that genocide when it like, and this is the weird thing, and this is going to sound weird coming out, but it actually doesn't help their goals. Their goals aren't aided by genocide. They're hindered by genocide. But the thing is, their goal is genocide now. It's always been genocide, but it's that stability of their project is less important to them than their racialized hate of these native people. So this is something so profound that we're watching, and to the point where, like this guy, this Abu Naranha, Donald Trump, in charge of the US, is clearly being blackmailed. Clearly, it's so obvious. They had a whole operation to get guys like him into a situation where they could never not do what they want them to do. And here, this is what happens when you do that. You lead your country to a disastrous defeat that not only, it's not like the US hasn't lost before, but this defeat invalidates all of their prior wins, and it erases all of their forward progress that they made, right? Because the US also mixes too, right? The US mixed, right? Like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, those are Western countries. Those are projects of the West. They're administered by pedo, aristocratic, Khaliji Arabs, and laboring class is like a brown army of basically slaves, of like indentured servants and whatever. Like, sure, it's peopled by non-whites, but ultimately it's a fused project. Like those, and that's why they have to have American military and British military in Jordan. They can't just trust Jordanians because it wouldn't work. It just simply wouldn't work. So now they created a situation where they moved in beside Iran. And now they're regretting that because now they gave Iran more targets. So all of those resources, 35 years of like getting your, truck out and putting all your stuff into your apartment, going to U-Haul, putting it in there, like moving your stuff. Like that's what the US military has been doing to the region. It's been bringing in all these, probably by now, like trillions of dollars worth of assets into this extremely important to threaten Iran. So that one day, which is the day which turns out was February 28th, that like, this is, that they were going to launch this war and it would be done and we get our dividends and we have 100 years of perpetual Zionist peace. And that's what their dream is. Like, that's their fantasy. But that's the fantasy of someone who believes in their own racial supremacy and their own genetic supremacy, first and foremost, and not a realistic person that assesses the world around them. That says like, this is a disaster. This country is a massive fortress and it has a bajillion missiles and drones and we're going to enrage them. And then by the way, Hormuz, and by the way, like they're in the middle of the freaking Asian continent, which is proving to be the most important continent again. So like, this is, this for me, I think we just have to keep having these conversations. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jay. 2 hours and 20 minutes. I never have episodes like this. Never. It was only with you. You should have been a therapist, Jay.
That's why you got to come over here, because we do the long streams. We bring in the people that do the But no, great, Sina. It's been good to talk to you. I mean, just a few closing thoughts on stuff that you've said. I mean, the defeatism thing, I do think that this is one of my fundamental issues with electoralism, and particularly with electoralism being like the primary vector of your politics within the US, is that you get so attached to what happens in these individual races, and it's so easy when you then lose to fall into kind of defeatism. And I think, I don't know. I do encourage people always to like join organizations. You talked about like going out and touching grass and connecting with people. And that, that's really what I mean is like I do think that stuff like this, it does risk falling into being a commodity, being entertainment, right? So on and so forth. I get that people get some psychological benefit from hearing people that see things in similar ways to them. I'm sure they disagree with us, as we know in the chat, on many individual things, but like they're here largely because they appreciate the perspectives that we have and that we bring and the guests that we have on. And I don't diminish that. I mean, Lara Shihai has been great for me in helping me to understand the value and the importance of that for people, that in developing, to use her term, that psychic militancy. But I do think that ultimately people do have to get into spaces with others if they want things to come better from whatever. If they want to build a resistance force or build an anti-war movement or build a fight for socialism or so on and so forth, like you got to be a part of something to do that. Like we can't really bring that about as individuals, and producing that individual isolated subject is like the greatest victory of Western civilization, right? Like this idea of just producing this individual subject that sees a lot of meaning just in what they do as an individual. It has to be collective. The other thing too, I mean, to the point you raise about Zionism and the US and the integration and this idea of like, thinking about the Gulf states as like a part of that project and all of that. That's true. And I think, this is why capitalism has been a focus for us from the beginning, is that it is through this economic system that ultimately all of the power is fucking organized for this shit. It is also why the media apparatus that we run up against in all these different ways is so, you know, so powerful and able to project in such ways. Even if it's declining, it's also what gives the US all these fucking resources for bombs. It's what Israel, like it's all of those things. And I don't encourage people to think that there's some individual thing again that you can do to get outside of it. Like we all fucking participate in this financial system. We work for it, whatever, we pay taxes to it, all of those kinds of things. We buy shit that supports it. But again, like that's where I do think one, the kind of anti-systemic, counter-hegemonic forces in the world are interesting. I think US sanctions producing this kind of all the devastation and destruction and genocide, right, that has produced over the last 50 so years. But on the flip side of it, also it has created these alternatives in a certain way, or these relationships that have been forged in certain ways through being denied access to it. And that hasn't produced, to me, what I would ultimately ideally want it to be, right? Which would be like a great, communist or socialist bloc that is a real alternative and is trying to confront that system at a purely systemic level. But it has produced possibilities, and it has produced it. Iran is very much the, a part of that in its own way, and their own level of autonomy from that system, but because it has been sanctioned and because it has proximity to China and relationships that have been forged of other sanctioned countries and so on. And so that is another product of the US like sowing its own defeat, I think, ultimately. And it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that in the coming years. Like, how do they, because clearly, yeah, Trump and Rubio's thing is just to go fucking, nightmare fuel on Latin America
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
all of that shit.
To make themselves feel better about losing West Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, but like,
No, it's a
that's
dangerous
a,
moment that way. Yeah.
it's a diminishing returns project, but yeah, it's very scary for Cuba, for Venezuela, for Ecuador, and like all of these countries that are facing different levels, Bolivia, right, of this revanchism and this ascendancy of the right, and all of the CIA basically just electing people for other countries like regularly now. Like, we don't even talk about
They also elect
coups
people
anymore.
here.
Yeah, that's true. um but we don't even talk about like coups anymore, right, in Latin America as much. They still happen, of course, but like it's more often that they'll just rig the election, and then there's nothing that the country, Colombia, right, like all of this stuff, Honduras. So anyway, yeah, it's a time of decline, and I think that one of the things that they want to do with all of this new Red Scare stuff, again, you mentioned Calla Walsh, shout out to Calla and the shit that she's facing and dealing with, but also, the whole Cuba report is an attack on all, like, obviously it's two-pronged. It's a pretext for an upcoming invasion that they're clearly trying to plan for Cuba, or some kind of decapitation, whatever they're looking to try to do in Cuba, that we should be resisting, and there should be a movement against that's much stronger than it is. But also, it is a pretext for all of this repression, within the United States and other aspects of the imperial core, of aspects of the left that they're scared of, even in some cases very small, organizations and groups. But that's like what you were saying about Move, is like doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a big alternative or a big, counter hegemonic force for them to try to snuff it out, right? And
And in fact,
but
it's probably better
yeah.
to hit them when they're small, because it's easier to break them and you make an example. And like
Yeah.
so much of this is making an example. Like so much of
Yeah.
like imperial power is like, you see that guy who resisted, I'm going to put his head on a spike, and you're going to look at him and you're going to see his eyes, and it's going to remind you not to like, wait out of turn. And I think the fact that that kind of violence didn't work on Iranians, and it just simply didn't work, because that's all that they could do. The only thing they could do in the US empire is to convince Iranians to not fight back. And that was my, I didn't actually think it was happen, but I guess in my paranoid brain, I was thinking like, maybe that's one scenario. Like maybe, and like, in January, I mean, this, we were in communication the whole time, and it was dark times in January. And my worry was, and probably because I was watching too much Western media, which gives you this sense that like, oh my God, they're going to hit the bases. They're going to get the missile bases. And it's like, no, man, like these guys, they had this, like, this was the plan. This was the plan for God knows how many decades for Iranians to break the siege, was to wait for a time for your enemy to make a critical mistake, to then lead them into thinking that, whatever. And then just everything since, like, I mean, this war has been such a disaster, every single aspect of it, from how it was launched to how it ended, the ignominious MOU, like they're all, I mean, I'm speaking from an American imperial perspective, obviously. I mean, it's great for Iran. I mean, don't get me wrong. They killed and destroyed a lot of Iranians, and destroyed a good number of buildings. But at the end of the day, if you as a people decide that death and destruction is not enough to get you to stop fighting, then you will win. You will win. Like, that's the lesson of the world. That's the lesson of this war, that you will win. And yeah, I mean, maybe it's also that thing I brought up earlier, that Iran has like the 5-tool player thing. Like, not every country is Mike Trout. Sorry to be a dork, but like, not every country can be Mike Trout in terms of like its inheritance of like the surrounding sort of contextual things around it. Like, some are landlocked, have no resources. Like can Kosovars, for instance, resist like, American occupation? No. Can Germans? Actually, Germans probably could. They choose not to because it works for them. Bad example, but like that is something that those countries cannot do, because they are, in a lot of ways dependent on external actors to bring them things, energy, weapons, access to the sea, for God's sakes. Like these are not things that these are things that countries lack, that hurt their own ability to defend their sovereignty. And when you can't defend your sovereignty, a big fish comes into your pond and eats you up and swallows you up. Right. And the big fish is a European imperialist power, by the way, usually, almost entirely. So or controlled by those people. So this is not, I feel like that this moment broke us, that we broke out of that mentality of 3 weeks to Baghdad, that okay, Syria took a long time to crack and it required immense amount of resources and the entire world and 15 years of, suffocating sanctions. That took a long time, but they still got their goal. But that's the thing, much in the same way that Brits won those wars in the 18th century, that they ended up losing, they won the battle, sure, but they lost the war for control over North America eventually. That because that mode of imperialism just wouldn't work. Sending a letter that would reach 2 months to be oh yeah, we had a bad winter crop, we have mass starvation, send food, that's too hard to do. You can't run a country by letter over the seas. That was a fiction of British settler colonialism, that they could do that, which is why they would empower things like the East India Company to do this work for them, to delegate it, or they would find local elites to do that work for them. But in the case of Iran, none of those strategies worked. They tried everything, and then they got to the end. They say, okay, we do the final thing, which is war. And even then that failed, and it then failed everything backwards. So I say that we should take this time to sort of seriously reflect on the nature of American power and what it means for all of us to live under its umbrella, but also that umbrella has a bunch of freaking holes in it, like a missile, like Khorramshahr-sized holes in it. Because at the end of the day, the U.S. is a paper tiger, that its power that it has over you is psychic and economic, which is not insignificant, mind you. And it does have the ability to kill you if you are one of these resistant countries. I mean, how did it go for Maurice Bishop? I mean, how did it go for him? They just straight up came there in an afternoon, killed him, and then left. And we've never heard of independent Grenada again. I mean, I haven't followed Grenadian politics for a long time, so it's not I don't know, maybe there are moves and stuff like that. I remember the stuff in Jamaica, the president of Jamaica, or prime minister actually, she was talking last year. And I also think the fact that China has now provided okay, you don't like that system? How about our system? You get all this nice stuff and we don't bomb you. We build you bridges, actually. We build bridges for you, actually. So that's even the Panama stuff. They tried to fuck with China's connection to the Panama Canal. Panama backed out. They couldn't even bully Panama into remaining anti-China. No, the U.S. is definitely declining from the world. It's just, what do we do inside of that decline to help accelerate it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couple things as we close. Appreciate it, Sina. But we should lift up a couple of campaigns. I was thinking, so Samir Project, of course, and then what about Mohammed? Do you want to do his?
Yeah, Mohammed's. Yeah, so he's doing well. Everybody should support him. He's my Gaza son, and I love him to death. And I want to, everybody should give money to any fundraisers, really. But if you want to support Mohammed, I have a few. I tweeted on my own thing. On my own Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, I tweeted a few, but you don't have to look very hard to donate. I would say if you are out there, you listen to this stuff, pick someone and just set a recurring donation for, $20 every couple of weeks. You won't miss it. It won't be a huge thing for you, more than likely. And it'll make a lot of difference to them. And if we could do that, why can't Hassan Piker do this shit? That's my annoyance. Why can't he help pull on this rope with us? Imagine if he did that instead of eating ass of every freaking U.S. war criminal who rebrands. Come on, man. I mean, that's a real thing. He could do that. But the thing is, if he started posting Palestinian fundraisers, Twitch would fuck him up, I bet. He's probably afraid. I bet he's afraid. He's oh, okay, I don't want to lose my thing. Or, and Colonial Epstein's regime says CIA. That's another answer. But it's I don't know. I find it disheartening that this easy thing we can do. We can help these people, not just in Gaza, too. Lebanon, there's places, people in Iran you could support. Just pick someone, pick two people, $10, $15 a month. That's all you need. Yeah, so do that. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here, Jay. Thanks for doing this. You always do this art. You always take time to do this beautiful artwork. So thank you. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for everything you do. You're always I was like, wow, I'm doing 4 recordings this week. I feel like Jay's done like 18 in like 2 days. He's a beast.
Not sure. All right, man.
He's a beast. Take care, Jay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
everyone in
you.
the chat.
Yeah, thank you, chat. Appreciate it.
Thank you.